like this. We're going to do our best with what we have. Teddy Roosevelt is quoted as having saying, "Do what you can with what you have where you are." It's a fortune that I once got in a fortune cookie, and I keep it taped to my desk at work. So we're going to do what we can with what we have where we are. And with that, we are ready to begin. Welcome back to Mishna. I'm very excited to join all of you. I have taken the liberty of muting you, again, a rabbinic power that I will be loath to relinquish when life returns to something more like normal and we gather in person. I know that it will be difficult for me not just to hit a button and everybody is quiet. You probably wish you had the same ability to do that to your rabbi. Nevertheless, let us pray together. Even though we can't hear each other, you can mouth the words and we will know that we are saying the blessing for the study of sacred literature. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you to the eternal source of life, who provides us with the opportunity to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Torah meaning accumulated Jewish wisdom and not just the 5 scrolls, or the 5 books of Moses. Our subject of inquiry is Mishna. I'm going to give just the briefest of overviews because I recognize that I've designed the course in a way that we're going to proceed sequentially through a very large and thorny body of Jewish literature. But I also want to make it possible that if somebody missed the first session or even misses a session at any point going forward, that he or she will not feel entirely adrift. So having said that, a few words about the ground we covered last week. Much of last week's, or 2 weeks ago, beg your pardon, on July 9th, which was the first class. So if you're joining us for the very first time, don't worry, you're really not behind. You'll pick right up. A goodly portion of our study 2 weeks ago was a lecture format introduction to Mishnah. I endeavored to present to the class a very wide swath of Jewish history to the best of our understanding, and especially the cataclysmic social and intellectual forces that germinated the rabbinic movement. And it would be unwise for me to recapitulate all of that here today. However, I'm happy to report that we recorded the class. It's on my YouTube channel. If you need the link, just email Natalie at the temple office, and I'm going to put Natalie's email address in the chat box. She is Natalie Rodriguez at wrtemple.org. You can also tell Natalie that you'd like to be on the email list for this class only. We won't spam you. It's strictly for communication about this class in case there are, usually I use it to send out the recording within a day or so of the actual class so that you can rewatch the parts that you missed, or send to all of your enemies that you would like to put into an anesthetic stupor. And just send my video. So there's the full lecture is online is what I'm trying to tell you. Essentially, the thing you need to know is that the Judaism, such as it is of the Torah, and the religion of the rabbis are 2 very different animals. The religion of the Torah, I hesitate even to call Judaism. The Torah itself does not use that term. The Torah doesn't actually refer to what this thing the Jewish people are supposed to be doing is going to be called, but I call it biblical Israelite religion. It is a cult centered around an ancient temple and priesthood, all of which had essentially been overthrown, destroyed, turned to rubble at the dawn of the rabbinic era. And of course, it didn't just happen overnight. And some of this upheaval takes place in the political realm, so wars with the Romans, both in the year 70 and in the year around 133, 135 in the Bar Kokhba uprising. ended up with the condition of the Jews being even further subjugated than they had been as a kind of vassal state under Roman rule, or the rule of Roman governors, some of whose names you might know, like Herod the Great or Pontius Pilate. These figures from both Jewish and early Christian literature are known to us because they identify the main power player in the Judean province, which is the remaining Israelite or Jewish territory during what is called the Second Commonwealth period. That is to say, the period after the return from Babylonian exile, when the second temple, the one after King David, so the temple that was built by the returning refugees from the Babylonian exile, was still standing. It's meaningful that I bring up all of this particular history about the temple and its destruction right now, because next week we will be observing Tisha B'Av, that moment on the Jewish calendar that commemorates national destruction, beginning with the destruction of both of the temples. The first temple, the temple of King Solomon, 950 BCE, and the destruction of the Jewish Commonwealth. The building of the temple was in 950, approximately. The destruction in 586 BCE. Temple was rebuilt and destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 CE, or what our Christian friends call AD. All of this political upheaval was also accompanied by a great intellectual revolution in Jewish life, led by the descendants, the intellectual descendants, of a group that is identified both by the historian Josephus and by the Christian literature as the Pharisees. And although the Pharisees are reviled figures in Jewish memory, in Christian memory, for Jewish people, the Pharisees should be remembered as the predecessors, the direct predecessors of the Rabbi, who both cherished the Torah and the biblical literature, but were committed to its interpretation and the unfolding, ongoing interpretation as a way of experiencing God's revelation at Sinai, even after the written Torah and Bible had been canonized. So we spent a lot of time last 2 weeks ago talking about canonization. Again, it's all taped on the lecture if you missed it, if you'd like to get caught up to speed in excruciating detail. What I would simply acknowledge before we dive right back into our text study today is that the rabbis engaged in a thoroughgoing project to remake Jewish life. And again, none of this happened overnight. Rabbis had been teaching and interpreting Torah for centuries at this point. By the time the Mishnah was completed, the Torah was 500 to 700 plus years old. The Bible somewhere between 500 and 600 years old. So this was literature that had been around for even longer than, for instance, Shakespeare has been around for us. In the same way that we regard Shakespeare as kind of the canonical Western English literature par excellence, so too biblical Jews and post-biblical Jews, especially the Jews at the dawn of the rabbinic period, regarded their literature as canonical. Which means, at least for our people, it means that it was understood to be the Word of God, but that God's Word could be experienced in ongoing revelation, or what we call oral Torah, where the kind of the mythos that surrounds the revelation at Sinai is that God continued to communicate everything that would ever be said, read, understood about the written literature, also to Moses at Sinai, and that it would later be kind of transmitted down the generations from Moses to Joshua, Joshua to the prophets to the elders, the men of the great assembly, and on down to the rabbis. Now, this is a kind of self-bolstering frame for understanding the transmission of God's revelation at Sinai. In other words, the rabbis are essentially saying, look, we have a direct line to what God wanted to tell the Jewish people. That's the conceit that frames their great literary project, which is called Mishna, a word that means teaching. And effectively, although Mishna is often mischaracterized as a code of laws, rather I present to you Mishna as a handbook for how to live a Jewish life in the minutest of detail, so that there is no moment of any day or life experience that is untouched by the considerations of rabbinic thought. And that is exactly where we landed at the end of last week with an extended study on the very first Mishnah in the Mishnah. The Mishnah, capital Mishnah, refers to a 6-volume body of work that attempts to organize Jewish life into neat topical categories. And each of those 6 volumes, or what are called sedarim, like seder, the word meaning order, each of the orders of the Mishnah is subdivided into multiple, in some cases more than a dozen per, tractates. The Hebrew word for tractate is a masechet, or plural masechtot. Don't worry so much about this terminology. I give it to you only because I'll use it. And I'll continue to provide a translation when I use a word that might be unfamiliar. Masechet, or a tractate of the Mishnah, a subdivision of each order, is a word that means webbing, like the interstitial tissue between fingers or toes. So the tractates are the webbing, the orders are the building blocks of the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is really the first major building block of post-biblical Jewish life, at least that got written down. There's plenty of other extra Mishnaic literature that is not codified in the Mishnah, but that it appears that the later rabbis who take the Mishnah and grow it yet further into the great body of Jewish wisdom that we call the Talmud, those extra Mishnaic or extra Talmudic documents appear to have been accessible, at least in part, to the rabbis of the Talmud. So it's interesting to note that the Talmud, although nominally a super commentary on the Mishnah, and we're not here to study Talmud. You gotta learn a little Mishnah before we can do a deep dive into Talmud, because Mishnah itself is challenging literature for a first timer. And every time I reapproach the literature, I feel like a first timer myself because of the new insights that are obtained. But I also would submit that the Talmud is interesting not only for what it contains, but for what it does not contain. And that takes us back again to questions of canonization and who gets to decide what's in and what's out, but we're not going to take those up today. What we are going to do is actually study some Mishnah. So just, I'll put up on the screen, pardon me, I'll put up on the screen the text that we looked at last week. I'll briefly recap, and that will give us all the prompting we need to pick up with this week's study. So you can see on your screen, and by the way, if you would like access to this text as well online on your own devices to study on your own or to have on a simultaneous separate screen, you can. You can see that the web address is through sefaria.org, which is a fantastic online free resource of Jewish texts. It's extraordinary, and it's just growing every day, kind of like Wikipedia. So Sefaria, sefaria.org, comes from the Hebrew word sefer, which means book. So Sefaria is like kind of like a book emporium, a Jewish sacred literature emporium online. And then you just go to Sefaria and search for the text you're looking for. The whole Torah is there, the whole Bible's there, and the whole Talmud is online, though not every jot and tittle has been translated into English. The entire Mishnah, I believe, is online in English, as well as in Hebrew. So don't be intimidated by all the funny dots and squiggles on the screen. That's the Hebrew of the Mishnah. I just want to use that to highlight where we looked last week and the entire subject of our inquiry. And I forget that every time I try and use highlighter, it kind of makes the screen funky. But you can see I've highlighted the very first line of the Mishnah. Don't be deceived by the punctuation. All the punctuation, all the vowels, all of that is added much later. So it says in Hebrew, me'e matai, which means when, but specifically from when. The Hebrew letter mem meaning from. Me'e matai, from when, korin, may we or may one, may one read rather, that's the verb. Kore is to read. So me'e matai korin, from when may one read et Shema be'arvit, the Shema in the evening. That was the entire subject of last week's class, 2 weeks ago. And again, if you missed it, it's all on the recording. You can email Natalie for the link on my personal Rabbi Blake YouTube channel. You could probably also Google Rabbi Blake YouTube channel and it would show up. So the question of the first Mishnah of the Mishnah, and every paragraph of the Mishnah is called a Mishnah. So the Mishnah is the whole work. Each subset is each tiny subset, each little paragraph, or what we call in academic speak a pericope. Each little pericope is a Mishnah, which just means a teaching. So me'ematai korin et Shema ba'arvi. From what time may one recite the Shema in the evening? And there was it turns into a very interesting rabbinic debate over how do you know when it's time to say the bedtime Shema or the evening Shema. And all of this, by the way, we talked at some length last time that the rabbis presume, even though the Mishnah is intended to be a handbook for all things Jewish life, you get immediately that there's a vast amount that the rabbis are assuming the reader already knows. That might be a window into the kind of audience or readership the rabbis had in mind when they composed this work. They're clearly suggesting, I think, implicitly that the Mishnah is a guide for the already literate male Jew. The basic frame of reference, I think, is what we would call today in Yiddish a yeshiva bocher, right? A young man who is training in the ways of Jewish learning, potentially for the rabbinate himself. So if you remember that the baseline assumption is that the reader of the original reader of the Mishnah was a young male rabbinic scholar, that may help you not feel so bad about all of the references that you personally don't understand. But I think most of us are aware that because the Torah commands us, thou shalt speak of them in your home and on your way, when thou liest down and when thou risest up, etc., and so forth, words that we chant in the Ve'ahavta, which is part of the evening Shema itself, that there has long been an understanding that Jews are supposed to say the Shema when you lie down and when you rise up. And that is all the Torah tells us on the subject of when you recite the Shema. And even whether or not the Torah meant to actually literally recite the Shema is very much in question. Because if you look at the text itself, it just says, you know, these words which I command you this day shall be upon your heart. So the text is already speaking in metaphor, right? The fact that rabbis literalized phrases like bind them as a sign upon your hand and let them be a frontlet between your eyes into the ritual of taking words of Torah, putting them on scrolls inside of tiny leather boxes with straps, wrapping it around your arm and sticking one on your forehead in the form of tefillin or phylacteries. And if you look up the word phylacteries in the dictionary, you'll find tefillin. So I don't know. I'd never heard of phylacteries until I learned how to put on tefillin. In any case, whether or not the rabbis meant, whether or not the Torah itself meant for such dicta to be literalized in such or concretized in such ways, I would challenge. But the rabbis tend to take every word of the Torah, if not literally, then extremely seriously. And so when the Torah says, speak of them in your home and on your way, when you lie down and when you rise up, this begs the question, well, when exactly are we supposed to do this, right? I get when you lie down, when you rise up, but when is it too early to say the evening Shema? When is it too late to say the evening Shema? And so last week's entire Mishnah conversation concluded on Mishnah Berakhot. By the way, this is the first tractate in the Mishnah. It's called Berakhot, which means blessings, brachas. And interestingly, it is all part of a Mishnah called Zeraim, which means seeds. No, we're not going to look at that. Sorry. Okay, so we talked at some length about what the rabbis think about when you can recite the bedtime Shema, the evening Shema. And there's a debate. And by the way, it goes without a final resolution, which is very characteristic of the Mishnah. So we're not going to look at the whole thing, but you can see if you scan the English that it begins with this statement, well, you can say the Shema in the evening from the time that the priests enter their houses in order to eat their truma, or sacrificial produce offerings, until the end of the first watch, according to Rabbi Eliezer, the words of Rabbi Eliezer. So look, you could spend a semester just on that one line. What the hell is the truma? Why are we talking about the priests? I thought the priests don't exist anymore, at least not in any way other than ceremonially, which is true. When is the end of the first watch? And we see already that we're deep in the weeds, and that the rabbis want to link the recitation of the bedtime Shema to an ancient priestly cultic practice that no longer existed at the time the rabbis were writing this literature. And that in and of itself is fascinating. Why not just say, you can say the Shema from 6 p.m. until midnight? Well, first of all, the rabbis don't have clocks. Secondly, sundials don't work after dark. And so you'll see later on in Mishnah Berakhot that figuring out how to tell time after dark is very difficult. So instead, the rabbis go on two separate notions. One, let's take a known quantity, such as when the priests used to have dinner time, and presumably the priests would be the last of the people to eat, because they first had to administer all of the sacrifices for the evening or for the afternoon service before they themselves could have their nosh. Secondly, it tells us that the night is divided into different watches, specifically, I think 4 watches of 3 hours each. So let's say the first watch is approximately, and that would go from sundown to sunup. So let's say, depending on the time of year, something like 6 p.m. until 6 a.m., a 12-hour period from 6 p.m. until 6 a.m., from dusk until dawn, divided into 4 watches of 3 hours each. So maybe we're talking about approximately 6 to 9 p.m. Maybe it's 7 to 10, depending on the time of year, right? Unless they eat like people in Spain, in which case you don't have dinner until 10 o'clock. But let's assume that that wasn't the way of ancient priests in Israel. And then you have all of these stories. Well, one is, well, what happens if you're out at a party and you get home late? And so they have a whole conversation about, well, we'll give you a grace period till midnight. Then there's a second story that comes in and says, well, there was this story of these kids of Rabban Gamliel. They went to a party. They came back late. They said, Dad, is it too late to say the Shema? He said, no, if the sun hasn't risen yet, you have to say it. And effectively where we ended was there's actually a built-in grace period all the time. Similarly, all the offerings that are to be eaten within one day may be eaten till dawn. Why then did the sages say until midnight? In order to keep a man far from transgression. In other words, yes, technically you won't be penalized if you wait until 4:30 in the morning to say the Shema if you're out carousing with your buddies. You should still come home, no matter how inebriated you have been, and get your siddur out, get your prayer book out, and daven. But we don't want to tell people that they have all night long, right? Because if you tell people they have all night, then you're going to have people saying, well, the sun came up at 5:30 today, and now it's 5:50, and I kind of forgot about the Shema last night, so maybe I'll just sneak it in. The rabbis are saying, no. So they said the cutoff is midnight. But, parenthesis, you won't be penalized if you wait. That is as far as we got last week. Okay, so I've managed now in the course of about 22 minutes to recap everything that I did in about 100 minutes last time, which probably makes those of you who were with us 2 weeks ago regret that you even came to the first session, since you've now gotten a very thorough summary. I'm going to pause here before we read the second Mishnah and just ask if there are any questions about anything that we've covered either 2 weeks ago or this morning so far, so that we can study Mishnah and all be, as it were, on the same page. If you would like to ask a question, you can enter it in the chat box, or you can raise a digital hand, or you can just unmute yourself. Russell, would you unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for the recap. Even great works of literature and opera do that. But my question is, when we're looking at the deadline for when we are doing this, is it possible that there's another subtext? The Shema is the most basic prayer in Judaism. It's almost like saying, when do you start being Jewish, and when do you reaffirm that you're Jewish? And it seems to me that of the two standards we're given, midnight is means you're governed by the clock. You're saying the deadline is imposed. You reaffirm your Jewishness because you are subject to a higher and perhaps arbitrary law. But the second one depends on us. It depends on our behavior, and it carries you into the next day. So you reaffirm your Judaism because it's propelling you to the future. It's propelling you to eternity. Is it possible that under the guise of telling us when we say the Shema, we're actually being told why we're saying the Shema?
Yes. I love that. I'll just let your comment stand because I think it's more comment than question. I think that and it's also just the fact that this is where the Mishnah begins is in and of itself a fascinating line of inquiry. Why this question? Why here? Why start the Mishnah with this question specifically? What do the rabbis, what's the deeper message that the rabbis wish to communicate about the meaning of being Jewish? I'm going to just let the question stand because I think that it's great material to marinate as we proceed through our inquiry. Thank you, Russell. There's a question in the chat box from Rena and Alan. What are the dates of the first Commonwealth from Solomon's death until the destruction of the first temple? Yeah, more or less. Generally, while the Temple of Solomon stood, so probably not from his death, but from the completion of the construction of the dedication of the first temple, again, in the latter half of the 10th century BCE, is the date conventionally assigned to the period of Solomon, though we don't have any extra textual or archaeological evidence to back that up, until 586, which is the date associated with the Babylonian conquest of Judea in the early 6th century BCE. That's the first Commonwealth. Then there's the Babylonian exile, typically assigned a 70-year period. And then in the latter part of the 6th century BCE, you have the exilic community, or at least its leadership, allowed to return to Judea under the edict of Cyrus the Great of Persia, or Koresh, as he was named. Yeah, most of us know Koresh from that whack job David Koresh, who holed up with a bunch of other religious crazies, militants in Waco, Texas. But he got his name from two biblical leaders, David, the Israelite king, and Koresh, the Persian monarch, who actually overthrew the Babylonians at the end of the 6th century BCE and allowed the Jewish exiles to go back to their ancestral land. So let us then proceed. And we're going to pick up at Mishnah Berakhot, chapter 1, Mishnah number 2. So, second paragraph. It will come as no surprise to you that because the first paragraph of the Mishnah is, when do you recite the Shema in the evening? Or from when may you recite the Shema in the evening? What do you think the second Mishnah is going to be about? Any guesses? You can unmute yourself. I no longer have the power to unmute people. I can only mute you. That's something Zoom instituted for some reason. So if you want to speak up, you can just chime in.
What time do you say it in the morning?
Right. What time do you say it in the morning? By the way, there are all sorts of embedded assumptions and comments that one can observe kind of in the lines in between the text. Russell pointed out, I think, a very big such opportunity. So one other observation I would draw to your attention is the fact that the Mishnah begins with the evening Shema and not the Shema that you say at dawn. And you might ask, wait a minute, why are we starting at the end of the day? Why aren't we starting with the Shema that happens at sunrise? And the answer, of course, is that Jewish days don't begin at sunrise. Jewish days, everybody on this Zoom surely knows, begin at sunset. If you buy a Siddur, whether it's an Orthodox Siddur, a prayer book, or a Reform Siddur, it always has the evening service first. Check it out. You ever wonder why Shabbat evening services are like on page 4 in your prayer book and morning services are on page 70? That's because Jewish time starts in the evening and goes to the morning. You all know that, of course, but I think that it's fun to see it reflected in our texts. Okay. If you look at text 2, and I'm flashing my cursor down by the first word again, notice it starts the same way. Me'e matai korin et Shema b'shacharit. So the first text is Me'e matai korin et Shema be'arvit. From what time may one recite the Shema in the evening? Mishnah number 2, Me'e matai korin et Shema b'shacharit. From what time may one recite the Shema b'shacharit, in the morning? You ever heard of a shacharit service or shachris? Right, that's the morning service. But shacharit literally means the pillar of light that emerges when it is dawn. So the shachar, or shacharit, is dawn. And let's go to the English. From what time may one recite the Shema in the morning? And so that's the question, and then the rabbis answer their own question. From the time that one can distinguish between blue and white. If you've ever wondered, by the way, why the colors of the Jewish people, and therefore of the Israeli flag, are blue and white, this is the text. There's nothing else that would suggest that Jews should think about blue and white as particularly Jewish colors, but I have a whole bunch of leftover Hanukkah wrapping paper that suggests that blue and white is Jewish. I guess because it's really different from red and green, but that's not why. It's actually from the Mishnah. From the time that one can distinguish between blue and white. So what is needed in order to distinguish between blue and white? Anyone can chime in, either by a chat or raising your hand. Or unmuting yourself.
Light.
Light. Right. In the middle of the night, I mean, really, if you like to sleep, as I do, in a kind of bat cave environment where no light can get in, and even the smallest little sliver of light is enough to wake me up in the morning, which is why I hate this time of year, because I'm a night owl. I stay up late, and then at 4:50 in the morning, there's this holy beam of light coming in through the window, no matter how much light blocking material we put into our windows, something always gets in. You need light in order to be able to tell color. Even more accurately, by the way, from a scientific perspective, you need light for there to be color. What color is an apple in a dark room? The answer is the apple has no color in a dark room. It may have pigment, but color is a function of light. This is not the same question as, does a tree that falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it make any sound? Right. That's different. I believe that, yes, the tree makes sound. But an apple in a dark room is not red, believe it or not. In very, very, very early morning light, everything is kind of gray. And you might not be able to tell blue from white. So you need a little bit of light to tell blue from white. Blue and white are very different hues, very different saturation. White has no light saturation. Black has complete light saturation. Blue is somewhere in between. So you need a little bit of light. Now you might think that we are talking about, for the first time, a more of a natural, celestial way of understanding when is it morning enough to say the morning Shema. But you'd be wrong. Let's read the next line. Rabbi Eliezer says between blue and green. So just very quickly, is Rabbi Eliezer's position more stringent or more permissive?
More stringent.
In that?
Harder to tell the difference between blue and green. There are shades in between. Rather, blue and white is pretty clear cut.
Exactly. So in one sense of the word, more stringent. In another way of looking at it, however, he's more permissive in that you get more time to sleep in.
Right.
In other words, for Rabbi Eliezer's position to be the one that you uphold, it has to be later in the morning, right? There needs to be more light, and therefore he's suggesting you don't actually have to say the Shema at the very crack of dawn. You can wait a little bit later until you can really tell the difference between blue and green. Now, I want to go back because does anyone, and I know that Joanne, you could raise your hand on this, does anyone know the Hebrew words for blue and white? There's even a popular Jewish song called Blue and White. So does anyone know the words for blue and white?
Kahol v'lavan.
Kahol v'lavan. The typical word for white is lavan, and the typical word for blue is kahol. But that is not the shade of blue that is indicated in this text. So if you go to the Hebrew, I'm just going to read the Hebrew and I'll translate. Me'e matai korin et Shema b'shacharit. From what time may one recite the Shema in the morning? Okay. Mi sheyakir, from when one can tell or one can distinguish bein tchelet lilavan, not kachol. It's the same root, by the way. It's kaf lamed hey, but here it's tchelet lelavan. It's a very particular shade of blue. Now we're going to get deep into the weeds of Jewish practice, and you really got to know your Torah. Where in the Torah is this shade of blue mentioned? There's one place very specifically where tchelet is referenced. It's actually referenced several places, but there's a passage in Numbers chapter 29. If you know the answer, you can chime in. If not, I will spoil it, because this is not something I would expect you to know.
Is it the construction of the Mishkan when they're describing the threads that are used for the weavings?
Yes, excellent. The threads that are used for the weavings of the ancient tabernacle, which would be like its fabric curtains, and not just ornamental, but the functional curtains, but they were woven in beautiful patterns where the principal palette is crimson, purple, and I'm going to try and mute everyone because there's some background noise. So if you could just mute yourself for a moment, because we're hearing some interrupting noises. Thank you. So there's a reference to tchelet as the particular dye that was derived from a nautical creature, some kind of a snail, to make the specific blue hue for the ancient Mishkan. Now, that same blue hue comes up in a few other Jewish contexts. Ellen wrote it, and Ellen got it on the nose. Isn't it also the color of the threads in the tzitzit? Ding, 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 ding. Exactly. In Numbers chapter 29, the Torah commands Jewish people to affix a fringe or a tassel to the corners of their garments. And it says, thread through the tassel a fringe or a thread of tchelet, of this specific blue that is derived from a biblical snail or some other nautical creature. I'm going to see if I can do this actually. I'll stop the screen share. And I actually, this will really tickle your funny bone, but I'm going to go on to Amazon.com. Okay, I'm doing this right now. And I looked up tzitzit with tchelet. Yep, there we go. So I'm going to show you on my screen something you can actually buy on Amazon.com. Believe it or not, if you want to have your own tzitzit with a thread of blue, you can order them from Holy Land Market Tzitzis, a set of 4 tzitzis, white with blue thread, tassels with a longer blue Messiah thread in royal blue. But you notice that the way I got there was I searched for this thread here, tzitzit with tchelet. And so if you like, now these are, most of the time, most people you meet have tzitzit there. They also have it in sky blue, and they have it in navy. Because nobody knows exactly what shade of blue the Torah is talking about. We don't have access to exactly what kind of snail the rabbis had in mind, or the Torah had in mind when it said, put a thread of tchelet into your tzitzit. I know, and most of you are like, what the hell are we talking about? I thought we were talking about when you say the Shema. Bear with me. We'll get back to that. The point is that the rabbi said, okay, you got to be able to distinguish a particular shade of blue. Maybe you have to be able to have enough light and your eyes are open in order to see blue against white. Rabbi Eliezer says, no, it's blue against green. You should have more light in the room, right? You got to wait because it's a much finer gradation. And woe betide anyone who is colorblind, because forget it. Telling the difference between blue and green is not going to happen. The tchelet, this shade of blue, which you notice from Amazon.com, we don't even know exactly what shade it is a very important little detail in the Torah and in the Mishnah. The rabbis, I'll tell you what the rabbis are up to for a minute, but first I'll say why I don't have a talis with tchelet. These are special order items. If you go to the market in Jerusalem, or you go to any like Judaica shop on Ben Yehuda Street, or wherever you go, wherever you get your nice Judaica, West Side Judaica, you're not going to see a blue thread in a modern talis. How many of you, men particularly, have a tallis from your childhood? No, I'm asking from your childhood. Right? Just show of hands. Lots of people have talesim. Anyone? Does anyone have a tallis from your childhood that has a blue thread in it? No. This only became popular in the last few years. Like literally in the last 30 years, some super Jews decided to put the blue thread back in their tallis as a way of honoring what the Bible actually tells us about the tzitzit, the fringes. Most Jews, myself included, have always had a tallis with only white threads. Why did Jews stop putting the blue thread in their tallis? Because the Torah says you should have a blue thread in your tallis. Well, the answer is that there are a lot of things that the rabbis insist, particularly in the modern era, you just don't do so long as the temple is not standing. The rabbis are basically saying, we won't know what kind of snail to use to produce the blue dye until the Messiah comes. Therefore, tzitzit are only white. Right? No blue threads. That's a biblical thing. Our ancestors knew it. We don't have the snail. When the Messiah comes, he's going to bring back the snail so that we can manufacture the blue dye and bring back this biblical custom. There are a number of things like this in Jewish tradition. How many of you ever heard of the ritual of the red heifer? Right? It's a ritual that involved finding a cow that was perfectly red with no blemishes whatsoever, inside or outside, slaughtering it, burning it, taking the ashes, grinding the ashes, taking the ashes and putting them into a potion, and sprinkling the potion to remove the contamination that comes about when you run into a dead body. Numbers chapter 19. Happy thoughts. The rabbis, by and large, are in agreement that the red heifer ritual, if it ever existed at all, certainly cannot exist today because we don't have access to the biblical perfectly red heifer. Therefore, we won't get a red heifer until the Messiah comes. Now, there are some really fabrenta, like really, really zealous Jews in Israel who are actively preparing for the return of the Messiah and the restoration of the temple cult. Yes, it's true. This should scare you. There was a book by the late author Robert Stone called Damascus Gate about a group of activist, zealot Jews who basically, in their zeal to see the Messiah come back and build the third temple, decide to blow up the mosques on the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa. Terrifying scenario because it's so possible. In any case, somebody wrote, don't some Chabadniks have a blue thread in there? Yes, some Chabadniks do this because they believe that when Rebbe Schneerson is or was the Rebbe, he died in 1995, I think, but many Chabadniks believe that their Rebbe is still alive or that he's the Messiah. So because for Chabad, at least for some Chabadniks, Chabad Hasidic Jews, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Messiah already came, now you can wear the blue thread in your tzitzis again. How did we get on this tangent? Or this, we went down quite a rabbit hole here. This was all intentional. I knew we would do this today. I'm not just riffing. This is in my lesson plan. I'm looking at my notes. Talk about the blue thread. Let's extrapolate the big picture here. You might think, and I'm going to go back now to sharing the Mishna on screen. Oops, I gotta change it though because I'm still on Amazon.com. Bear with me, please. You might think that when the Mishnah says there needs to be enough light to tell the difference between blue and white, that maybe we are talking exclusively about natural phenomena, right? You need enough light if you have an oceanfront property to tell the difference between the sand and the sea. You might think that if you have lakefront property, you need to have enough light to tell the difference between the lake and the reed grass in front of it. This is not correct. The rabbis, very cleverly, are tipping their hands in the direction, tipping their hats in a different direction. They are saying, no, the light that you need has to be sufficient to identify the blue thread in your tzitzis. In other words, it's linked to a biblical behavior. It's in code, right? It's an allusion that unless you are a very learned Jewish reader, you might miss. You might think, oh, blue and white, okay. Land and sea, green and blue, grass and water. That's not what it's talking about. It's saying you have to be able to pick out the blue thread in your tzitzis. Because what do you have to do before you say the Shema? You got to put on your talis and then your tefillin. So once again, the rabbis are actually linking time itself, as a function of Jewish practice. I'm going to say it again because this is the, I think, very bold, almost mind-blowing proposition of Mishnah's numbers 1 and 2 in Berakhot. Time itself is a function of Jewish practice. Either when the priests used to have dinner, or when an ordinary Israelite or an ordinary Jew can see the blue thread in the tzitzit of his talis. Time, of course, if you were to ask Albert Einstein, who was not just a scientist but a religious philosopher, time is an elaborate illusion, he would say. Time, he would say, is simply a ruse under which human beings have to operate. We are prisoners to the idea that there's a past, a present, and a future. But if you study relativity, you realize that time is actually, as the theory itself says, relative to space and velocity. So that's a scientific finding. The rabbis, of course, did not have access to such learning. What the rabbis are saying is time is actually a function of Jewish practice and not the other way around. If you want to know what time you're supposed to do something, figure out something else from ancient Judaism. And remember, the rabbis don't have access to the ancient temple cult. They're recreating it in memory. They're using little symbols and touchstones and images and code words to know the building blocks of Jewish life here and now. So how do I know when it's time to say the Shema? I do not look at my clock radio in the morning. I would not look at my clock radio in the morning. If I'm following the wisdom of the Mishnah, I put on my talis, and if there's enough light in the room to see the tchelet, the blue thread in my tzitzit, now I can daven. Questions thus far? Because that's kind of like a real whopper of a claim. But I want you to see that. Michelle Braun writes, the most recent hard copy edition of Moment magazine, possibly online, does a nice job of exploring Jewish time, including Einstein. And Steve asks, when does Shacharit have to finish? Well, we're going to get there. Any questions so far? You follow? It's kind of cool, right? Okay, let's read on. So from the time that one can distinguish between blue and white, Eliezer, either more or less stringent, depending on how you understand him, says between blue and green. And he must finish it by sunrise. So there's Steve Maskett's question. I think Steve was asking, when today can one finish Shacharit? And the text will tell us that. So you must finish it by sunrise, which remember I said that Shacharit literally means the first pillar of light that emerges at dawn? So it's the very first ray. But dawn is when the orb, the full circle of the sun is now above the horizon. So that's, according to Eliezer, that's how long you have. Not very long. These days, this would be between about 4:55 in the morning until what, 5:30? Right? It's a very small window between the first ray of light, or the first pillar, the first rosy pillar on the horizon, and the full circle of the sun visible in the sky. Maybe an hour? I don't know. I'm a night owl. I don't typically get up and watch the sunrise. I hear it's great, though. Rabbi Joshua says, until the third hour of the day, for such is the custom of the children of kings to rise at the third hour. If one recites the Shema later, he loses nothing like one who reads in the Torah. We're going to get to that. Let's take Rabbi Joshua. You can see already that Rabbi Eliezer is much more stringent than Rabbi Joshua. Rabbi Joshua says, no. You got 3 hours to do this. And again, at this point, we can talk about hours and we don't have to talk about the night watch. Why? Why the difference? Why did we spend the evening Shema talking about this idea of a 3-hour night watch times 4 equals 12 hours of night? Anyone know the answer? Yeah, Alan.
Because there's a sundial, so you
Exactly.
can measure hours.
Exactly. Now you know, we have a way of telling time by day, so you know how long an hour is. So Joshua says, you've really got until 8 or 9 a.m. to get your morning Shema in. But look at his reasoning. This is fascinating. See where my mouse is? See where my cursor is? Right here. Shekain derech b'nei melachim. Shekain, like for such. Kain means yes, but such. Derech means a path or a way. B'nei, like ben, children of. Melachim, from melech, king. Really, you don't need a lot of sophisticated Hebrew to understand Mishnah. I'm willing to bet that many of us on the Zoom could translate Sheken Derech B'nei Melachim, because that's the way of the princes, children of kings. La'amod, to stand, like Omeid, na la'amod, to stand, bishalosh, on the third sha'ot, on the third hour. Literally to get up at 9 a.m., those lazy bums. Because why is it that children of kings, or that is to say princes and princesses, but it's not important that we're really talking about the men folk. Why do kings get up so late? Why do royalty get to sleep in?
Because they can.
Because they can. They don't have jobs to get to, right? So, but here's what's interesting. What is the larger conjecture by saying every Jewish person can sleep in and still say the Shema? Think of the encoded message in the Seder, right? We used to be slaves, avadim hayinu, ata b'nei chorin. Now we are free men. And the whole point of a Seder is to reenact what it felt like to be a Roman nobleman or noble lady. You would sit reclining at a triclinium table. There would be entertainment. There would be overflowing multiple cups of wine. We are going to emulate the royalty of our time. The rabbis were very into this idea that Jewish people should never forget that we are a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That we are, in a sense, royalty, even though we are a subjugated class. Therefore, in Rabbi Joshua's opinion, we should be able to sleep in before having to say the Shema, because, after all, why is some prince any better than we are? Does that make sense? Do you follow? Okay. And then finally, if one recites the Shema later, so in other words, let's say I really slept in. Let's say I slept till 9:30. And I realize, it's now 9:40 and I haven't said the Shema yet. And I can definitely tell the techelet on my talis, even if it's like teal outside. Like I can really see the fine gradations of color. The Mishnah says if one recites the Shema later, he loses nothing. Literally, hakorei mikan ve'elach, the one who reads from that point on, hakorei mikan ve'elach lo hifsid. He hasn't lost out on anything. Ki adam hakorei batorah. In other words, the rabbis don't want to say that you can't say the Shema. There's no problem with saying the Shema anytime. Just like one who reads Torah. There are fixed times for the reading of Torah. Monday morning, Thursday morning, and all day Shabbat. Those are the fixed times for Jewish people to read Torah. But there's nothing wrong with reading Torah on a Tuesday afternoon. It's just that you don't fulfill the mitzvah. You're not released from the obligation to do it, so you really do have to get up and say the Shema before it's way too late. But if you get up and want to say it, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with saying the Shema. You haven't invalidated the practice by saying it late. Does everyone follow Mishnah number 2? Let's proceed. Okay. We're going to meet two of the most celebrated figures in Jewish literature for the very first time today in Mishnah number 2. And I would like for, Joanne, I've called on you already, but Joanne, you're a teacher of the Jewish youth of America. Would you please unmute yourself and read this Mishnah? And we'll read the whole thing and then I'll unpack it.
Okay. Beit Shammai said, I have to just move the screen.
Okay.
Beit Shammai say, in the evening, every man should recline and recite the Shema. And in the morning, he should stand, as it says, and when you lie down and when you get up. Beit Hillel say that every man should recite in his own way, as it says, and when you walk by the way. Ibn. Why then is it said, and when you lies down and
It should be when you lie down. That's
when you lie down, okay. And when you lie down and when you get up. At the time when people lie down and at the time when people rise up. Rabbi Tarfon said, I was once walking by the way and I reclined to recite the Shema, according to the words of Beit Shammai, and I incurred danger from robbers. They said to him, you deserve to come to harm because you acted against the words of Beit Hillel.
Okay, stop. Thank you. You can mute yourself up again, Joanne. I appreciate the reading. Beautifully done. Let's unpack. There's a lot going on here. Let's start with Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Beit is not a person's name. Beit is the construct form of bait, which means a house. So Beit Shammai literally means the house of Shammai. And we're not talking about his personal household or the physical domicile in which he lived. We're talking about an academy. So we have these important figures. I'm going to call them figures in Jewish memory. Because again, we do not have any supporting documentation either in text or in archaeology that would corroborate the actual existence of a person named Shammai and a person named Hillel or an academy in their names. However, they do exist in tradition. My own guess is that they probably were real guys, and they probably each did raise up disciples, and they probably did vie, at least in an academic sparring kind of way, on lots of minute matters of Jewish law, actually matters of Jewish law and practice, great and small. But I think that by the time the Mishnah is written, which presumably is as much as 300 years after the purported span of Shammai and Hillel, who are said to have stood in the 1st century BCE. So these are pre-Jesus figures. And you notice, by the way, that they are not called rabbi. Shammai and Hillel are just Shammai and Hillel. So it is a mistake to refer to Hillel as Rabbi Hillel. He does not actually have the title rabbi. That's not because he was an inadequate teacher of Jewish law. It's because there were no rabbis yet. Hillel is just a master teacher. Only later, around the time of Jesus, do you have figures being called rabbi, including Jesus himself in the New Testament, by the way, or in the Christian scripture. Jesus' disciples refer to him as rabbi, which means my teacher. I think that by the time of the rabbis, that is to say, at least a century or two on, Shammai and Hillel have come to be literary archetypes by which differences in Jewish law and practice can be elucidated. Does that make sense? In other words, they've become kind of like stock characters for representing position A and position B, or more to the point, position A and position not A, because Hillel and Shammai are, again, archetypes of differences in opinion. What Shammai says, Hillel opposes. What Hillel says, Shammai opposes. It is almost always phrased in the formula of, here's Shammai's opinion, and then Hillel comes along and says, here's my opinion. Almost invariably, this is a question you can answer based on this text alone or from your general understanding. Almost invariably, which academy wins the dispute? In other words, which opinion is favored in Jewish law and practice?
Hillel.
Of course, because we don't go to college and have Shabbat dinner at the Shammai house. Right, okay? So Hillel's opinion prevails. There are actually 3 notable exceptions. We're not going to come to them today. They're all really interesting. The 3 cases where Shammai actually is given the gavel in his favor. But for the most part, Hillel wins, and that's why he gets his name on the colleges. Even more importantly, of the two opinions, the one represented by the school of Shammai and the one represented by the school of Hillel, which is the more stringent and which the more permissive? You can get the answer to this question strictly from today's text. Okay, I know you all know the answer. Hillel is the more permissive and Shammai the more stringent. And that translates not only to their rulings, but also to the legends and lore that accumulates around the character of these men. It's very clear that Shammai is depicted almost two-dimensionally, cartoonishly, as very, very strict, not very tolerant, letter of the law. Whereas Hillel is much more open-minded, room for interpretation. One of the most famous stories is the man who goes first to Shammai and says, teach me the whole Torah I want to convert to Judaism, please teach me the whole Torah while standing on one foot. And Shammai gets so irritated by what we would call this klutz kasha, this annoying question, that he chases him out of his house or his store with a reed, right? He's like, get the hell out of here. What a stupid question. I'm not going to teach you the whole Torah on one foot. Then he goes to Hillel, and Hillel says, okay, what is hateful to you, do not do to any person. That is the whole Torah. All the rest is commentary. Now go and study it. Everyone forgets the last three sentences. Everyone says, just be nice to your neighbor. No. Hillel said, what is hateful to you, do not do to any person. That is the whole Torah. All the rest is commentary. That is not to diminish all the rest of it. A lot of people say, yeah, all the rest is commentary. That's not the tone or the force with which that sentence should be understood. He's saying, all the rest which is commentary, you must now go and study. So I taught you everything you need to know on one foot, but you are not released from your obligation to go and learn it. Anyone, all 60 of us who are participating in this Zoom, you are now following in the ways of Hillel. You're studying the commentary. So good for you. And I think the bigger point is that in this kind of like cutesy way, a lot is said about how Jewish tradition understands Shammai and his school and Hillel and his disciples, right? Shammai is just, the walls are very high and almost impenetrable. Whereas for Hillel, the doors are wide open. And I think that that's why Hillel gets to have his name on the colleges. Okay. So now something that can allow us to put these ideas into practice, the evening Shema. And now we started with the evening Shema. The second paragraph was on the morning Shema. Now we're going to talk about the evening and the morning Shema together. So there is a logical flow to a lot of how the Mishnah is organized. You can see that unlike the Torah itself, we're proceeding logically through a single topic. And we're going to really tease out as much detail and meaning from this one topic as we can. We're still on when you say the Shema. But now we're moving a little bit to, well, how do you say the Shema? Because the Torah says, when you lie down and when you rise up. Now, Beit Shammai says, in the evening, every man should recline and recite the Shema, and in the morning, he should stand, as it says, and when you lie down and when you get up. In other words, Shammai says, you must take this literally. When it's time for the nighttime Shema, I do this. I'm just going to Shema Yisrael, right? I literally have to be lying down. And in the morning, I should literally be standing up to say the Shema. And Hillel comes along and says, give me a break. That's not what it means. Because it also says, and when you walk by the way. In other words, do it your way, which is a brilliant way of understanding when you walk by the way. Let me do the Hebrew here just to jar your memory. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, you shall love Adonai your God, b'chol levavcha u'b'chol nafshecha u'b'chol me'odecha, with all your heart, mind, and soul. Ve'hayu hadvarim ha'ele, and these words, Asher anochi mitzavecha hayom alavavecha, which I command you this day shall be upon your heart. Okay. Vishinantam levanecha v'dibartabam, speak of them in your home and on your way. Oh shoot, I just lost it. Vishinantam
V'shivtecha b'beitecha
u'v'lechtecha v'derech, when you are lying in your house, and V'shivtecha b'veitecha uvlechtecha v'derech, and when you walk along the way, uvshochbecha uvkumecha, when you lie down and when you rise up. And thanks, Dad. I needed the order. V'shivtecha b'veitecha, first when you are sitting in your house, or dwelling in your house, uvlechtecha v'derech, when you are along the way, then when you lie down, when you rise up. And Hillel says, look, it says, when you're going about your way. So Hillel is committed to a non-literal interpretation of that text. He said, no. When you walk along the way doesn't necessarily or literally mean when you are strolling down the street, you should be chanting the Be'ahavta or reciting the evening Shema. What it means is that as you go about your ordinary way of doing things, you should recite the Shema. So just do it whatever way you like. You don't literally have to be lying down for the evening Shema and standing up for the morning Shema. And what does it actually mean? Then you do it at the time when people lie down and at the time when people rise up. So you have Shammai the literalist and Hillel the figurativist, right? So Hillel says, figurist? No, figurativist. I think I just made a new word. Shammai says, literally lie down, literally stand up. Hillel says, no, just do it your way. Do it at the time that people lie down and the time when people rise up. And now we have another ma'aseh, or a maisa. Remember last week or 2 weeks ago, I told us the origins of the word baba maisa? These are the real reasons we study, by the way, because you get all the fun tidbits as we go. The word baba maisa literally means a grandmother's act or tale, T-A-L-E. A maisa or a ma'aseh is an anecdote about the rabbis that illuminates a certain thought about Jewish life or practice. So you do you get rabbis who tell you here's the law, and they can use their brains or logic to explain why we do the law. But you can also illuminate why we do something from a case or a precedent. This is how lawyers work as well, right? You can establish the meaning of the law either through interpretive mechanisms, or you can establish the meaning of a law through the way in which it has been applied in the past. And so if you have evidence that a certain person or figure did something in a certain way, and that person is considered to be authoritative, at least in the context of the Mishnah, that would be helpful in knowing what you're supposed to do. I'm going to get to a question that was asked in the chat window in a moment. So now we have a ma'aseh or a maisa about Rabbi Tarfon, who does pop up in the Haggadah if his name is familiar. Rabbi Tarfon said, I once was walking by the way. There you go. He's doing what it says in the Shema. And I reclined to recite the Shema according to the words of Beit Shammai because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. I was out for an evening stroll, or I was returning from the market. And by the way, it's dusk. It's getting dark outside. And I said, well, Beit Shammai says it's time for the Shema. Guess I got to lie down. So I go and lie down right by the side of the road. Schmuck. Okay, but let's just say, okay. So he lies down by the side of the road, and I incurred danger from robbers. I got mugged. I got pickpocketed. And what did his colleagues say? Well, you deserved it because you acted against the words of Beit Hillel. They literally say, putz, what are you thinking? You don't go and lie down by the side of the road. And more to the point, they say, Hillel's our guy. Come on. Like Shammai, that's just too far. And if you take things too literally, if you're religious, I really dislike religious fundamentalists in general, but I especially dislike people who say they are religious fundamentalists. They say, well, I believe in the literal word of the Bible. I'm like, okay, recite it when you lie down and when you rise up. The Bible's filled with figurative language. And I think Hillel understands that better than Shammai does. Okay, so that's the Maaseh. The question in the chat window, and then we'll open up for comments. Why do most services have the Shema recited standing? Well, that's only in Reform settings, interestingly, because go figure, there's an old joke about this, about the congregation is at war when the new rabbi comes in. Every time he signals for the Shema, half the congregation rises, half remains seated, people are up in arms. A regular davener comes to him and says, Rabbi, I believe that, we're supposed to stand during the Shema. Isn't that the custom? And the rabbi says, yes, that's the custom. And he says, another one says, no, you're supposed to be seated. And he says, yes, that's the custom. And he says, but we've been arguing about this for years. And the rabbi says, yes, that is the custom. Right? Okay, so to argue over these things is the custom. I think I butchered that joke, but you get the gist of it. The Reform rabbis of the 19th century believed that the Shema should be understood as the heart of the creed of the Israelite faith, the Jewish faith. It was so important, they said, that you should always stand for the Shema, at least in a service. Same Reform rabbis understood that you'd be doing this in the context of public worship in a synagogue, and they were very much about decorum. And so they did not like the idea that some people would choose to rise and some people sit and some people davening, shuckling back and forth, and some people on page 2 while other people are on page 16. So it was all part of the 19th century German Reform rabbinic program to make synagogue more like church, to be honest. And that's why we rise for the Shema, out of strictly Protestant decorum. That's a little bit disturbing, I think, for some of us, but that's correct. Ellen, let me get to Michelle's comment in the chat window, and then Ellen, you can speak up. Michelle writes, local practice, I've been to congregations where folks sit. So have I, by the way. I suspect standing is intended as a sign of respect and to grab participants' attention, not Hillel and Shammai. That's correct. Ellen Bittner, is this also saying we should do things with intention and not by rote? Beautiful. Ellen, do you want to just comment more on that? Because I think that question is as much a comment than it is a question.
Well, yes, because I wrote that in response to what the Mishna says, and then other questions and comments came up in the chat. It's also been my understanding that we stand for the Shema if we are seated to delineate reciting the Shema from the rest of the service. If we're standing, as for whatever reason, then we sit for the Shema to delineate.
Yeah, that was more custom than law, and it really is local. It varies from place to place. You remember, every time we say Shema, it is actually a Torah reading. I'll say that again. Every time you say the Shema, you're reading Torah. Not every part of the Siddur, only very, very few selections in the prayer book are taken directly from the Torah. Shema ve'ahavta. Ve'ahavta is just part of the Shema, by the way. We call it the ve'ahavta, but it's the very next verse. Deuteronomy 6:4 is Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. 6:5 is ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. So it's all one big paragraph. The ve'ahavta also weaves in paragraphs from elsewhere in Deuteronomy and the passage about the tzitzit from Numbers 29. Having said all of that, so some communities also invite congregants to rise for Shema the same way certain passages of Torah are also recited while standing, including the Song at the Sea when Mi Chamocha is said, and the Ten Commandments. So some people have justified the standing for the Shema in a synagogue setting as well. It's actually a public Torah reading. An aside that we'll get to later. What do you do before you read or chant Torah? What do you have to do Jewishly? You have to say a blessing, right? And how does the blessing go?
Berakhot et Adonai Havarach.
Great. Berakhot et Adonai Havarach. What are the words that we say before we get to the part of the service that contains the Shema?
Berakhot et Adonai Havarach.
Exactly. We say Baruch et Adonai Havarach, Baruch Adonai Havarach le'olam va'ed. The same call, we call it the Baruch, or the call to prayer, but what we're really doing is saying, listen up, Jewish people, we're about to hear a Torah reading. We're saying the same basic call to prayer because the people are being called to attention specifically for the purpose of a Torah reading. Both places in the service, both at the Baruch, which introduces Shema, or the Shema and its surrounding blessings, which we'll talk about in a moment. And it also is utilized again in the Torah service on Mondays, Thursdays, and Shabbat. All right, so Rabbi Tarfon gets his comeuppance, You shouldn't have just taken, like, you shouldn't have reclined or lay down in the middle of the road, idiot. Of course the bandits are going to get you. You should have listened to Hillel, a Maisa or a Maaseh that corroborates the point. We move on. I'll just start in the Hebrew just because I like to encourage all of you that it's really not that hard. Bashachar, at dawn, same word that we had before. Mivarech, the verb form of Baruch. So at Shachar, at dawn, we bless Shtaim, twice. Lifaneha, meaning before it. Ve'achat, which is echad, one. And once, le'achareha, after it. Exactly as it says here. In the morning, he recites 2 blessings before it and 1 after it. Pause. What is it? Yeah, I saw some of you mouth it. It is the Shema.
Wow.
So this is, now we're getting into the architecture of the prayer book. In the morning, let's start with the morning service. So for those of you who have davened or have had a practice of davening, we start with Baruch et Adonai HaBarach, or whatever your melody is for Baruch. Jewish people, time to pray. But even more, as I've just said, Jewish people were about to hear words of Torah. You're about to have a Torah service, as it were, in the form of the Shema, so you better get ready. Baruch et Adonai HaBarach, says the leader, bless God who is to be blessed. And the people respond, Baruch Adonai HaMivorach Leolam Va'ed, blessed is the one who is blessed forever and ever. Mivorach, by the way, is just an inverted form of Baruch. Baruch Mivorach. Also, remember that really bad tyrant over Egypt who recently died, Hosni Mubarak? It's the same root. Mivorach. Hosni Mubarak is Mivorach. By the way, Barack Obama. It's the same as Baruch. Maybe. Okay. I don't know. Okay. At dawn, one recites 2 blessings before it, meaning the Shema, and 1 after it. And for those of you who are Hebrew geeks, you notice that the word for it, lifaneha, the suffix is the feminine suffix, ve'achat le'achareha, 1 after it, feminine suffix. So you could translate 2 before her and 1 after her. In Jewish academic settings, the section of the service that we are examining is sometimes called the Shema and her blessings. Shema uvirchoteha. The Shema and her blessings, or the Shema and its blessings. The Shema is so important that it's like this little jewel that is protected or surrounded on all sides by loving words of prayer. So it's saying that before the morning Shema, you say 2 blessings, and then 1 blessing after it. And we're going to talk about what those blessings are. In the evening, you say 2 blessings before the Shema, and 2 blessings after it, 1 of which is long and 1 of which is short. So let's talk about the morning service. You get Baruch et Adonai HaBarach, Baruch Adonai HaBarach Le'olam Va'ed. We're called to prayer. More importantly, Jewish people were about to have a Torah reading. But we don't go straight to Shema. It says there are 2 blessings before it. So does anyone know, again, morning service, what is the first prayer you say after the Shema in the morning? So it's a prayer called Yotzer or sometimes we call it the Yotzer. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, Yotzer or uvorei choshech, osei shalom uvorei atakol, hameir la'aretz, etc. Blessed are you, O God, creator of light. So the first thing you say before Shema in the morning is, the sun is shining. It's the prayer for God as creator. Okay? The second blessing is something called Ahava Rabbah. Ahava Rabbah, Ahavtanu Adonai Eloheinu, Chemla Gedolah V'Torah. Basically, it says, with a great love, you, O God, have bestowed love upon the Jewish people. By giving us Torah and mitzvot, laws and precepts have you taught us. I'm just kind of amalgamating a bunch of different translations. So first we say, thank you, God, for restoring the world to light. And secondly, we say, thank you for the gift of love for the Jewish people Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. 2 blessings before. God as creator, God as revelator or revealer. The way in which God shows love for the Jewish people, the second blessing before the Shema, Ahava Rabbah, is by giving us the Torah. How do we know that God loves me? Because God gave me the Torah. And then we say Shema. Also, we are echoing through the structure, or the flow, the order of our prayers in the service, we are echoing God's role in the universe. God as creator, God as revealer. First, God created the world, and then the next great gift God gave us that we acknowledge in our prayers is God gave us the Torah at Mount Sinai. However, it's not just what happened in primordial memory or the distant past, if you believe the stories. It's also the way we understand God, renewing God's relationship in our lives each and every day. God as creator is not just about what happened at the beginning of time. God as creator is the fact that it was dark 4 hours ago and now the sun is shining. God as revealer is not just what happened at Mount Sinai thousands of years ago, according to Jewish story. God as revealer is, oh my God, I've got the Torah right in front of me here and now today, and God's revealed wisdom can reach me through this act of prayer and study. Follow? Those are the 2 blessings before the Shema. Then you're ready to say the Shema, because you've just said, the sun is shining, and I've got the Torah. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu, all the way through Ve'ahavta, and then it says 1 blessing after it. So in the morning service, as soon as you finish Shema, there's a bunch of stuff you say, but the heart of it is Micha Mocha. In the morning, we always sing a Micha Mocha, which is part of a longer set of liturgy, or liturgy is just prayer, or a sequence of prayers. A longer set of liturgy that describes God as the Redeemer of the Jewish people, right? God as creator, the sun is shining. God as revealer, I have the Torah. Then we say the Shema. And then afterwards, God redeemed the Jewish people, Micha Mocha, through the Exodus from Egypt. And now we can daven the tefillah together. The main prayers of the service, the Avot V'Imachot, the Givurot, all of those other prayers. If you're not following, that's okay. If you're not a seasoned davener, my point is not to make you feel lost or inadequate. My point is to show you that there's a very deliberate architecture to the placement of the prayers, and particularly the prayers that surround the Shema. But now a conundrum. The prayer that starts is God as creator. That makes sense. It's the first way we come to know God in the Torah. It's also the first way we come to know God in human life and in waking up in the morning. The next one, God revealed the Torah to the Jewish people. Thank you, God, for this gift of love. Now I'm ready to say the Shema. And then after the Shema, God redeemed the Jewish people. It's out of order, right? If you read the Torah, where is God as creator described?
Genesis 1.
Very first word of the Torah. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it's not really the best translation, but it will suffice for the purposes of this conversation. Where is God as revealer of the Torah? Where does God participate in the act of revelation at Sinai? Chapter and verse, if you got it. More importantly, let's get the order of chronology right. Before or after the Jewish people are redeemed from Egypt?
After.
After. A few months after. About 2 months after. First, in Exodus 15, is the Song of the Sea, Micha Mocha. We got to get out of Egypt. 2 months later, we come to Sinai. We receive the Torah. So why is the order of the prayers around the Shema not creation, redemption, revelation? That's the order of the experience of the Israelites. That's the proper order in the Torah. God was first revealed to us as creator of the world, then as our liberator or redeemer, and finally as the revealer of our sacred text. This is all just the traditional understanding. But in the Siddur, in the prayer book, the last two are inverted. It's God as creator is first, God as revealer is second, then you say the Shema, and that's important, by the way, I'm giving you a hint. And then finally, God redeemed us. There are a few possible reasons, but I would like somebody maybe just to unmute oneself and conjecture why this particular order.
Redemption's not finished.
Great. So one idea is that, remember how I said creation isn't just about what happened in the primordial times? Creation gets renewed every single day. That's part of the idea. Similarly, revelation. Revelation is something that didn't just happen at Sinai. It happens every time we crack open a prayer book and read the Shema, or when we study Torah or Mishnah together. My friends, we are all participating in revelation right now. Isn't that incredible? That is a Jewish view. You are part of the flow of divine wisdom that began at Sinai. That's how the Jewish tradition wants us to understand what we're doing on Zoom on July 23rd, 2020. We are figuratively at Sinai together right now. Redemption, the Jewish people being liberated from Egyptian bondage, is not only something that happened in the past. Liberation from bondage is not just something that is ongoing, it actually is future directed. And for the rabbis who are writing the prayer book, who are subjugated by the Roman Empire and who wrote under the threat of Roman censorship or worse, redemption is a code for what God is going to do to the Romans when God chooses to overthrow their power. In other words, and it's about what the Jewish people are put on this planet to do. We're here to be a light to the nations. We're here to redeem others from bondage as well. So redemption is definitively not primarily about the Jewish past. Redemption is about the future, about what we can do for others, but even more, what the Messiah will do for us. And that's why the order gets inverted. The other reason is that you want the Shema to immediately follow the prayer about revelation, so that you recognize that, oh, it was the gift of Torah that allows us to recite the Shema, and then we can all participate in the great liberation that is to come, not just recall the Exodus from Egypt. A few comments in the chat box. So too many rules for modern life. Yeah, I agree. That's how it goes. Don't study Mishnah if you don't like rules. Michelle, it appears that right from the beginning, the rabbis and by extension Jews generally were obsessed with precision and detailed instructions how to do everything. Correct. Presumably to track detail of instructions in the Torah. At least in part, yes. It makes me more sympathetic with the simplicity of Christian practice and Reform Jewish backlash. I think that's right. Paul, writing only 2 decades after the crucifixion of Jesus, basically rejects Mosaic law and the punctiliousness of the Pharisees around Jewish law because he recognized that that's no way to get lots of people to convert to your religion. Right? The bar for participation in Jewish life is much too high. How are we ever going to master all of this and also put food on the table? But that's not the way the rabbis think. The rabbis don't view it as a burden. The rabbis actually believe that, as Kelly and I often talk about, both of our work, and one place where our work tends to intersect is on the theatrical or the performative art of improvisation. And Kelly recounts to me something that I believe she was taught by a professor specifically of improvisational acting when she was in conservatory, in graduate school. And in freedom is discipline was the takeaway. From discipline, you find your greatest freedom in discipline. And that, at least for the rabbis, that's the idea, that all of these rules and regulations actually liberate your humanity and your spirituality. However, I am sympathetic to the Reform Jews and the early Christians who had a lot in common, in some ways, in their recognition that there's maybe a limit to how much you can find freedom in discipline. At some point, the liberating power of rules like this might be overtaken by a slavishness to the jot and tittle. Moving on. Where does the Modeh Ani fit in? That's the prayer that begins, Modeh Ani lefanecha melech chai v'kayam. I give thanks unto you, my God, my master, shehechazarta bi nishmati, who has restored my soul unto me, b'chemla, in love or in compassion. Rabba emunatecha, how great is your faithfulness. It's the very first thing, or one of the very first things, a Jew says upon waking up in the morning to pray. And it's in the prayer book. So even before, you never start a service with Baruch et Adonai Amvarach. Even though the Shema and the blessings that surround it are the first truly statutory part of a Jewish service, there's warm-ups. So the Modeh Ani is part of a long string of liturgies, psalms, prayers, songs, blessings, etc. that are, I call them spiritual calisthenics. Right? You don't just drop and do 20 push-ups. You got to stretch a little bit. And if prayer is the art of spiritual exercise, then you need to warm up. So you just start with some basics, right? Let's just get the breath moving. Let's get the blood flowing. Let's get the eyes open. Let's get the crust out of the eyelids. Let's get the gunk out of my soul before I can really say Baruch et Adonai Hamvarach, let's study Torah together. And that's what the morning prayers are designed to do. A question from Myra. Is the Mishnah written at the same time as the prayer book, or is the prayer book based on the Mishnah? That's a great question. The two clearly cross-pollinate. Although we don't have exact timelines, and they are both composed and anthologized over the course of not just decades, but centuries, it's clear that some Jewish prayer language that later gets anthologized or canonized into the Siddur, into the prayer book, is known from almost as early as the completion of the Torah, and maybe even earlier. I mean, obviously, the parts of the prayer book that are from the Torah directly are very, very old, like Michamocha, like Shema. That's centuries and centuries before the rabbis. But even things like, anytime you read the words Baruch Atah Adonai, that's rabbinic language. Those three words are nowhere in the Torah. There's no passage in the Torah that says Baruch Atah Adonai. That's a rabbi way of talking to God, or talking to God. It's God as direct address, second person, Atah, you, blessed are you, Adonai. But some prayer language, like Aleinu, especially, most scholars believe is very, very ancient, pre-Jesus, Second Commonwealth, while the temple still stood. Aleinu, many scholars believe, was one of the earliest Rosh Hashanah liturgies. Aleinu l'shabeach, where, because it talks about v'ne'emar v'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz. That's how the prayer ends. And so it has been said, on that day God shall be king over all the earth. Bayom hahu yihyeh Adonai echad. On that day God shall be one and his name shall be one. That's the purpose of Rosh Hashanah, to re-inaugurate God as king, Avinu Malkeinu, to re-establish God as the monarch or the sovereign. That's the meaning of Rosh Hashanah. It's a coronation ceremony for God. Bet you never thought of it that way. But in biblical times, that's what Rosh Hashanah was. It was, we are going to remind the Jewish people, and more to the point, we're going to re-coronate God as our king on the first day of the new year. So it was as much a new year for the Jewish people as it was a new year for God. And it establishes God's, on this day, thy throne is established. I mean, all of this stuff that's just clattering around my old brain from old prayer book language from Rosh Hashanah attests to that theme. So the Mishnah was probably compiled at the same time as the Siddur, but incorporates material, like the Siddur incorporates old material too. I think it's fair to say that the stuff that ends up in the Siddur and the stuff that ends up in the Mishnah is largely concurrent and overlapping. Shema is from the Torah. This is a comment. When did it become part of the liturgy? Again, probably very early. Probably even before Jews had a thing called a Siddur, there was still the custom of reciting Deuteronomy 4 and the following verses. Clearly by the time of the Mishnah, but can we tie this to King Josiah? Josiah reigned in the latter quarter of the 7th century BCE. I don't think we can definitively say that at the time of King Josiah, who is associated with the writing of the book of Deuteronomy. Okay, so that's why, if you know that the book of Deuteronomy was believed to have been composed in the last part of the 7th century BCE, and that's the book of the Torah that includes the Shema, maybe you conjecture that the custom of reciting the Shema went all the way back to King Josiah. I'm skeptical. I think many of the modalities of Jewish life and practice were developed in Babylonian exile and after, in the restoration of the Commonwealth, after the exiles returned after Koresh freed them. But that's a guess, and I'm hardly an expert in such matters. Individual warm-ups versus prayer in minyan. Yes, great. Remember how I said the first many prayers of the service are kind of like spiritual calisthenics? So the idea is that you got to get ready to pray before you pray. So you pray in order to be ready to pray. And a lot of the early morning prayers, like the first things you say, like Modeh Ani, or there's a prayer that Jewish people say after they've successfully moved their bowels in the morning. Very important part of the day. I think the older one gets, the more one really has cause for deep gratitude if the pipes are working. All pipes. So there's a prayer that basically says, thank you, God, for pipes that work. It literally says, thank you for the parts of my body that open, that are supposed to open, that do open. And thank you for the parts of my body that are supposed to remain closed, that do remain closed. Yeah, right. You want your apertures to be open, and you want the parts of your body that aren't supposed to be open to stay that way. So all of these, I should say, many of these prayers began, we believe, as homebound individual rituals. Like, there's a whole sequence of prayers that one says, for instance, like, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan l'sechvi vina l'havchin ben yom uvein laila. It's the first of what are called the Nisim b'chol yom, or the everyday miracles prayers. Literally, you've just said, thank you, God, for giving the voice to the rooster so that it knows so that it knows the difference between day and night, or between day and night. Thank you, God, for telling the rooster how to know the difference between day and night. When do you think you were originally supposed to say that prayer?
When you open your eyes.
Well, even before. Thank you, God, for helping the rooster tell the difference between day and night.
When you wake up.
Yes, prompted by what? Nature's alarm clock. The cock crows. When you hear the cock crow, even before you open your eyes, that's the point, by the way, because there is a prayer that says, thank you for helping to open my eyes. That's the one that says, thank you, God, who opens the eyes of the blind, which is another verse or two down the line in that sequence. The first thing you say is, like, you're still asleep, oh my God, that stupid rooster in the backyard. You don't say that. You don't curse the rooster. You bless God for allowing the rooster to know when it's time to get up. Imagine that. Imagine if the first thing you said when your alarm clock goes off in the morning is, thank you, Steve Jobs, for giving my iPhone the power to tell me when it's time to get up in the morning. I don't do that, but maybe I'd be a better rabbi and a better human being if I could. The whole idea is that these prayers, yes, in answer to the question in the chat box, they were designed to help discipline a person toward the art of elevating the spirit and summoning gratitude, when generally the first thing that we're thinking when we have to get up in the morning is not, yay, at least not for me. I mean, some people maybe get out of bed and like, I'm so excited. Maybe it's like my birthday or going to the beach. Most days it's like, oh no, why is that thing shining in my window? But these prayers were designed for home use, and then later prayer in a minyan. Like many Jewish practices, what began as individual stuff you would do at home or on the way, your own private spiritual discipline, gets consolidated, I believe, in part as a response to how are you going to create Jewish community without a central temple? Now we're getting back to the biggest picture of what the Mishna is really all about. The Mishna is all about how are we going to create Jewish life without a temple? And if every person is doing their own set of prayers, each on their own, the prayer book is also an illuminating window into the project that the Mishna is about. They're taking up the same basic project just through two different norms. Mishna for study and practice, prayer book for praying. But they're all about how do we create a Judaism that works if we don't have a central institution called the temple. On that note, we will conclude. I hope you will come back next week, same bat time, same bat channel, on this Zoom, as we will pick up with the remainder of Mishnah 4, which basically we've done because we've done the architecture of the prayer book. And in the evening, there's an additional prayer after you say the Shema, which you know as Hashkivenu, help us to lie down, O God, in peace. Why? Because it's bedtime and bandits might get you, even if you're not lying on the side of the road like idiot Rabbi Tarfon. So we're gonna finish that Mishnah, and we're gonna pick up right here on the famous passage from the Haggadah. If you've ever wondered about Ben Zoma and all those rabbis who were in Bnei Barak, here they are. We're gonna meet them next week. Berakhot 1, Mishnah 5. Have a fantastic week. I can't wait to see you. Please stay safe.
Toda Rabba.
Hydrate, stay cool. Lots of love. Bye, everyone.